Hello everyone, I'm Phil Agnew. But what are we going to chat about? Well, we're going to chat today about the science behind successful growth. In my podcast and in my role, I'm desperate about understanding the real science behind marketing, the real science behind marketing that works, and the real science behind companies that grow. So hopefully I'm going to give you a few tips, some tricks, some best practices to take away so you can apply that growth to your own business, to your own organization, to your own side hustle, whatever it might be. But I want to start with something a bit potentially controversial, and it's the idea that in general, I don't think marketers are very good at growing their business. And I think one of the reasons that is because as marketers, we struggle to really understand our consumers. We struggle to understand why they make decisions and predict why they do the things they do. And one of the reasons I think this is because of some of the stats that come out around marketers and around our efficiency. So this was a study by Recruiting Marketing back in 2018, and they surveyed hundreds of thousands of marketers across the globe. Thousands, I should say, not hundreds of thousands. And they discovered that around 1/4 of all marketing budget is actually wasted. So 25% of marketing budget gets zero ROI. That's a huge amount of inefficiency, compared to other roles. And it's not just inefficiency with the budgets we're spending, it's actual inefficiency with some of the projects we're doing as well. If you look at a study by HBR, a very famous study by HBR, they looked at new consumer product launches and discovered that around 80% fail. They fail to hit the targets they do. So there is this huge inefficiency within marketing. We struggle to get consistent growth. We struggle to maintain growth and to understand the science behind why things grow. And the problem is, if I was to ask everybody on this call why some campaigns fail and why others succeed, you don't get a clear answer. You get a really muddled answer. You get all sorts of reasons why people think marketing campaigns don't work or ROI isn't achieved, from anything from not having the right budget, from having the wrong team, from having a crisis come out at the wrong time, or from having a bit of a crappy boss. It's really difficult to understand what makes some marketing great and what makes some poor. And that's a real shame. And I think one of the key problems that defines all of these little problems that you could identify from chatting to everyone is this. Most marketing decisions are based on gut instinct. So according to Forbes, over 50% of the major decisions that we make in marketing, these are things like deciding whether or not to pull the trigger on a campaign, deciding whether or not to invest millions within an influencer. Most of those decisions are based on gut instinct. They're not based on data, they're not based on science, and they're not based on laws and understanding of how consumers make decisions. And I think this is a real shame, because if you look at professions that have a very high level of efficiency, that do not waste 25% of their budgets, you find something very different. If you look at lawyers, if you look at doctors, if you look at teachers, they don't base the majority of their decisions on gut instinct. That would be crazy. You've never asked a doctor to base decisions about whether or not to make surgery just based on their gut instinct alone. They base their decisions off science. They base their decisions off laws. And as marketers, well, in some ways, we're still sort of stuck in this Mad Men era, just trying to figure out what consumers might do and how they might act based on our own internal thoughts and feelings. But what if marketing had laws? What if we could understand the science behind marketing that works? What if there were frameworks and rules that we could follow to improve our work and grow our business? And the thing is, there are some rules, because we have spent, and I say we as in the community of psychologists, consumer psychologists, and behavior psychologists, they have spent hundreds of years understanding how the brain works. They've spent hundreds of years understanding why we do the things we do, why we make the decisions we do. And if we take that understanding of marketers and apply it to our work, we can start to see why consumers make decisions, and we can start to predict how they might act if we decide to make certain marketing. So I want to give you some examples of how you can apply this world of behavior science, this understanding of consumers, to marketing, and how that can drive actual growth. Because I think if you look at the science behind why people make decisions, if you look at the science behind consumers, you can actually massively improve your marketing and grow your business. So start with one that I'm sure all of you know, the idea of social proof. Now, social proof is the idea that we follow the actions of others. If you're walking down a street and you see a bunch of pedestrians looking through a window, you're going to want to look through that window as well. It's an evolutionary trait that's been with us for millions of years to to essentially allow us to survive. And if we take that understanding of people, if we take that understanding of how our brains work when it comes to social proof and apply it to our marketing, we can see really impressive results. So there's this brilliant study from a fantastic book that I'd recommend called The Choice Factory by Richard Shotton. And in the study, he went into a local London pub and he asked the barman at the pub what the best-selling beer was. The barman pointed out that it was this specific ale here. This was the best-selling beer. There's no signs or language in the pub to make consumers aware of that. So Richard asked if he could do one special thing to the pub. He asked if he could hang a sign on top of that beer, which was best-selling, which simply told drinkers that that was the best-selling beer. So they put a sign on it which said best-selling. Now, Richard hypothesized that if you tell people that there is a best-selling item, if you inform people that one item is selling very well, it'll encourage more people to buy it. Classic social proof. So the pub compared having the sign on the beer versus not having the sign on the beer week on week and found something, I guess I would say impressive. Maybe many of you marketers listening would think, oh, I could just expect that. But they saw a 2.5 times increase in sales growth. And what's fascinating about that is that wasn't just an increase of sales for that specific beer. It was an increase of sales across the board. People follow the actions of others. If we see other people are more likely to purchase a beer, we're more likely to purchase more of it ourselves, and we're even more likely to try it if we usually drink something else. That's social proof in a very quick little snippet. It's if we apply that understanding to our work, we can massively increase our sales. Another one is the endowment effect. Now, the endowment effect is the idea that we're more likely to complete a task that's already begun. So if you're working on something that's really difficult, if you really don't want to write an email to someone, if you just write the first couple of words, you'll find it easier to crack on with it. So we're more likely to complete work that's already begun. And there's a brilliant study of this from 2006, which is cited in Natalie Nahai's book, Webs of Psychology, where they gave two sets of participants coffee loyalty cards. Now, both loyalty cards, well, one loyalty card had 7 stamps to collect. So you go and buy 7 coffees and you'll get a free one. The other loyalty card had 9 stamps to collect. However, the barista, when they handed out that other loyalty card, had plugged the first 2 stamps in. Now, what's interesting about that is both of these loyalty cards are essentially the same. You still have to buy 7 coffees in both scenarios in order to get your free coffee. However, the endowment effect tells us that if something has already begun, if a project has already taken place or started, we feel more inclined to finish it. So what's interesting is participants who got the loyalty card, which already had 2 stamps plugged in, were 82% more likely to complete that card versus the control variable, versus the card with no stamps plugged in and 7 to collect. Simply put, people are far more likely to complete an action that's already begun. We can apply this psychology to our work. We can massively improve our marketing. And I'll finish with another one, which many of you know, which is loss aversion. It's that a loss, the pain from a loss is twice as painful for us as the equivalent gain. We really don't like losses, and we dramatically change our behavior in order to avoid that. And marketers can find all sorts of smart ways to apply this to get consumers to change their behavior. So let's say somebody is about to leave your product or leave your service. What do? Do you send them an email saying why they should stay? Do you send them an email telling them all of the great things that your product can do? Or maybe not. Maybe you send them an email saying all the things they'll miss out on. This is the email that you get from Amazon if you try and stop your Amazon Prime membership. Rather than telling you about all of the great free deliveries, all the great TV shows, all the great music you can get, they simply say what you're going to lose. They simply say you're going to lose £313 in money and delivery fees if you stop being a Prime member. Playing on loss aversion works. In fact, studies suggest that loss aversion can, if used in your sort of exit messages, can result in a 42% reduction in churn. And okay, we're here to talk about growth, but if you reduce your churn, you're far more likely to grow and get sustained growth as well. So loss aversion, social proof, the endowment effect, they're just a few quick examples of how applying the science of understanding consumer behavior to marketing can have a huge effect on increasing the effectiveness on our marketing, so to speak. So today I really want to dive into 3 specific areas and talk about 3 areas where I think science can really help you drive successful growth. I'm going to talk about distinctiveness, the power of being distinct. I'm going to talk about anchoring, and then I'm going to finish on scarcity. And I hope you will go away with some really solid ideas around these 3 principles that you can apply to your work to increase your growth. So let's start with distinctiveness. Now, distinctiveness is the idea that distinct things stand out. All of you are in marketing, I don't have to tell you that, you'll know that already. But you might not know the science behind distinctiveness, when we first discovered how distinctiveness was so effective. And it actually goes all the way back to 1933 with a researcher called Hedwig von Restaroff. And what she did is she gave participants long lists of letters to remember. But within those long lists of letters, there was a set of numbers within the long lists. And she asked the participants to recall as much as they could from this list. And it turns out the item that's distinct, so in this case, it's the number, is far more likely to be remembered and recalled. In fact, it's 30 times more likely, I believe, than the actual letters. So being distinct helps you stand out. Now, this is a study all the way back from the 1930s. Does it apply today? Well, researchers have looked to check if it applies today, and specifically to check if it applies for marketing as well. So in this study, participants were given a long list of different brand logos. Now, these brand logos all came from the same industry, all came from the automotive industry, for example. That's the example I've got up on screen now. However, they hid within these logos, well, not hid, they just placed within these logos one logo of a firm that was from a different industry. So let's say a fast food industry like Burger King is here. They wanted to see if having a logo, if having a company that stood out because it was from a different industry alongside a lot of other companies would increase recall. Turns out it does. Distinctiveness works. People are 4 times more likely to remember the company that is from a distinct industry alongside other companies compared to the rest. Distinctiveness helps you stand out. But what's so interesting about this fact, what's so interesting about this study, is it seems that so many marketers fail to apply this. When we look at where a lot of big firms tend to employ their marketing, we see that we're very quick to copy our competitors. So if you look at this is a UK example here, but if you look at the sort of football competitions in the UK, you see they are all sponsored by very similar beer brands: Budweiser, Carling, Carlsberg, and Heineken. If you look at the actual people who sponsor football clubs in the Premier League, which is the UK's main football competition, you find that 50% of them, a huge number of them, are sponsored by gambling firms. And that gets higher up, the lower down you look down the leagues in football. So we're very quick to copy our competitors. And what's interesting as well is these aren't small investments. They're big multi-million-pound investments, and yet they seem to go against the science we've just read about, that being distinct, being a unique brand within a category set helps you stand out. And before you think, oh, this is just big money sponsorship and they'll just pay to get their face everywhere. It's not. It's in other industries as well, industries like the SaaS industry. So these websites here, I've got 4 different websites on screen. Believe it or not, these are 4 different websites. These are not the same company, even though they pretty much look identical. We've got Zendesk, Asana, Buffer, Airtable, companies that a lot of marketers like myself, a lot of growth marketers really admire. And yet they seem to be falling foul to the same mistake. They seem to be copying competitors, seem to be taking the same inspiration from competitors, and are not standing out. Being distinct helps increase recall, and yet here you've got examples where it's not the case. But my favorite example of this doesn't come from SaaS industry, it doesn't come from the football industry, it comes from the watch industry. So take a look at these 3 ads. They are for different competitors. They look very similar. They've got a very similar style: celebrity holding or wearing a watch, looking at the camera or looking out into the distance. That's very similar, but that's not actually the thing that makes me laugh. The thing that makes me laugh is the time on the watch. Look at the time. In every single watch advert, these marketers set the time to the exact same time, 10 minutes past 10 in every single advert. They are so keen to copy competitors, so keen not to break the trend and not to take advantage of distinctiveness, that they even set the watch to the exact same time. And before you say, oh, this is just old traditional companies like Omega and Dior, a new fast growing company would never do this. Well, just hold on, because this is from Apple's launch last week. Even with the Apple Watch, they set the time to the exact same. We're so keen to copy our competitors. We're so keen not to break the trend in so many scenarios that we even blindly follow things like this. However, if you are distinct, if you do things to your marketing to make you stand out, you can see really impressive results. So take this example from Steve Martin's book, The Small Big. They were working with, I believe it was the Australian, I should say, tax collectors. And they had a big problem. The tax collectors were sending out letters to Australian citizens and nobody was paying their tax on time. So few people were paying their tax on time that they were having to charge Australians millions in late tax fees. The team that came in to help, Steve Martin's team, looked at the letters that were being sent. They were the letters on the left-hand side. Normal, blank, white envelope letters coming through your mailbox. They hypothesized that they were just being ignored because these letters weren't distinct, they weren't standing out, people weren't opening them, people weren't actioning them. So they trialed something. They trialed putting a big red stamp on the letter saying urgent and tested it to see if it made a difference. Turns out it does. Residents, when opening that letter or receiving that letter with a big stamp on it, saved 4 million in late fees. They were far more likely to open the letter, far more likely to pay their tax on time. Distinctiveness works. But it's not just in tax collection. If we go to Copenhagen, they had a problem with litter. Litter was being left all over Copenhagen, wasn't being put in bins. Now, traditionally, the way you would solve this is by paying more rubbish men and women to go and collect litter, or perhaps just adding more bins. But Copenhagen had an interesting idea. They hypothesized that the bins weren't distinct enough. They were blending into the background. They were grey and green and looked like everything else. So they tried something. They painted their bins neon, and they painted little footprints on the floor in some scenarios in neon to encourage people to just see the bins and notice where the bins were. This tiny change resulted in 45% more rubbish in bins and 45% less rubbish on the street, saving the council thousands of pounds, if not maybe millions of pounds, in rubbish collection fees, rubbish cleaning fees. Distinctiveness even works here. But what about marketing? You guys are marketers. You want to understand how you can apply this to your work. Well, let me give you an example of a great example of a company that applied distinctiveness a while back. So 10 years ago, lots of these different companies came to market, and what they were doing is something called basically utilities comparison. So companies like Compare the Market, Confused.com, USwitch, Go Compare, especially in the UK, these companies became very prominent. Users would go to these companies, type in their energy provider, and get to see better deals elsewhere. Hugely effective, very high growth industry. We all use it now, but 10 years ago, it was a fairly new thing. Now, when they brought these products to market, all of the competitors would advertising very similar things. They were talking about the benefits their products had, the features their products provide. Each of the different competitors were using very similar language, saying, we save you more, give you quotes in seconds, we're simple, fast and easy, we save you more than other companies. Problem is, none of these competitors were particularly distinct. And one competitor was really struggling to stand out, comparethemarket.com. They were saying all of these great benefits about their products, they were spending the right amount on their advertising, and yet people wouldn't engage with them. They were struggling to gain market share, struggling to grow faster than their competitors. So they tried something different. They looked at distinctiveness and applied a completely different tactic. Instead of talking about all of the benefits of their product, instead of talking about all of the features and things around that, they instead tried to be distinct. They created an advert with a mere and in the advert, all he did was complain about the fact that his website, comparethemeerkat.com, wasn't getting the right SEO because people were instead going to comparethemarket.com. And he just complained about that for a 30-second advert. It was a complete break from the norm. It was a complete break from what the competitor's doing. It was completely different from how a marketer would traditionally approach this problem. You know, gone were all the messages around benefits and features, and yet it was hugely successful. They had an 83% increase in awareness week on week, and they achieved their 12 months objectives within 9 weeks. Those are the initial facts. What I love about this campaign is it was so successful that 10 years on, they are still using this campaign. Being distinct helps you stand out. It really helps you gain market share and can really help you beat your competitors. In terms of how I've applied this, I've started my own podcast, which was mentioned at the start, and I really wanted to find a distinct logo that I could use for my podcast. So I looked at all of the other podcasts on the market, and there was a lot of people, there was a lot of sort of pastel colors, and I said to myself, I really want a color that will stand out. So hopefully with Nudge, as you can see, it's got a quite bright color that stands out compared to the rest. That was one of the ways that I've applied this, but there are heaps of ways you can do it. It's not just color. It's things like advertising in the right place. It's things like using a different medium to advertise. It's things like trying a different story, like how Compare the Market did. So lots of ways you can do it. So standing out improves your recall. However, most brands feel the need to copy competitors. If, though, you look at the studies with tax, with bins, with meerkats, you can see that being distinct really works. And in fact, it's probably a less risky way to grow your business. So instead of copying competitors, you should try and be distinct because it's a far more likely way you'll grow your business. That is the power of distinctiveness. Now let's move on to another one, anchoring. So anchoring is the idea that the initial piece of information we read or see about a topic or whatever it might be will heavily influence us for the remainder of the time we're engaging with that piece of information. So a great example of this is a study done with newspaper headlines. So participants were asked to read this newspaper headline and give their thoughts on it. So they read the climate change bill is to cost 100 million. And importantly, they also read who published this headline. So in this scenario, it's the Financial Times. Now, after reading this, they said, oh, you know, this sounds like a pretty good deal. 100 million sounds like the right amount. Thumbs up, essentially, from a lot of people. They were then told to go away, or firstly, answer a bunch of different questions, go away for 2 weeks and come back. And then they were shown the same headline, but from a different news provider. Now, for those of you who aren't in the UK, the Financial Times is a very prestigious broadsheet newspaper, very reliable. The Sun is a tabloid, not so reliable newspaper. And they were asked to read the same headline, but from a different publisher. Now, enough time had passed that they'd forgotten that they previously read this headline before. And this time, these same participants said something quite different. Rather than this being a good idea, rather than this costing the right amount, suddenly they thought, oh no, this seems like it's costing too much. This doesn't seem like it's a good idea. And they had far more negative connotations with this headline. Essentially, what we're seeing here is that the message is anchored dramatically by who published the message. So anchoring plays a huge effect on our perception, even when we're viewing two pieces of identical information. Now, a fantastic example of how anchoring can change our decision-making comes from Dan Ariely's book, Predictably Irrational. So he wanted to see if individuals would change their decisions just by thinking about a high or a low number, just by being anchored to think about a high or a low number. So he asked the individuals, this was in America, to pull out their social security cards. Everyone in America's got a social security card. It's got a number on it, and the number is completely random. Dan asked his students in the room to look at the last number on their social security card. He asked all of the students with a number from 1 to 4 to sit on the left-hand side of the room, and all of the students with a number from 5 to 9 to sit on the right-hand side of the room. He then just told the students to remember if you have a high or a low number. That was his anchor, and he wanted to see if it changed how students made decisions. He then brought to the front of the class 6 lovely items for students to bid on: champagne, a mouse, a keyboard, some books, and he asked them to place bids on these different items. Obviously, he was testing to see if that initial anchor, just thinking about whether they were a high or a low number, would change the amount they bid. And even Dan was surprised by the results, because it turns out those with the low numbers bid far less, and yet those with the highest numbers on their social security card bid almost 3 times more for these goods. This is completely irrational. This doesn't make much sense. The social security card is a completely random number, and yet anchoring has a huge effect on us. We are far more likely to bid more, even when we've just been anchored by a high number. How does this apply to the business world? Well, Steve Martin and Joseph Marks, who I talked about earlier, took this principle and tried to apply it to sales. Specifically, they worked for a UK real estate agent, and they wanted to see if the first time somebody calls up a real estate agent to buy a house, if they could anchor them with quite a specific message to encourage them to actually go ahead and buy a property from this real estate agent. So at the time, if somebody called a real estate agent, they would pick up the phone, speak to the receptionist, and the receptionist would say, oh, you want to sell your house? I'll put you through to Peter. Hang up the phone. Peter goes and deals with it. But Steve and Joe were convinced that if they could just anchor the message slightly, they would be able to encourage a far better rate of sales later on down the line. So instead of just passing the receptionist, or instead of the receptionist just passing the person over to Peter, the receptionist would say, I'll pass you over to Peter. He has over 20 years of experience and would be perfect for you. None of that's a lie. It's all true. It's just a slight tweak of the message to anchor the consumer with the initial piece of information they see to see if it will change the results. And just changing that versus the norm, versus the control variable, had a huge effect. Inquiries that heard that message were far more likely, 20% more likely to go on and become a valuation, and those valuations were 20% more likely to go on and become sales. Simply anchoring your message right at the start can have a dramatic effect on the amount of engagement you get on how your consumers act. It sounds irrational, but it's true. Just look at that Dan Ariely study we looked at earlier. Another example of this, and this is one of my favorite ones because it's a classic marketing campaign, is from De Beers. Now, De Beers are a diamond company. Now, way back in the 1930s, De Beers had a real problem. Only 10% of engagement rings were diamonds. It wasn't normal to go out and buy a diamond wedding ring to engage to someone. The reason being is because diamonds are just so expensive. They cost far too much. So De Beers needed to create a campaign which made people feel like it was normal to spend a lot of money on an engagement ring. Not an easy task, a real trouble for us marketers. However, they leaned on anchoring. They thought if we can add a bit of anchoring to our message, maybe we can convince people to spend more. So they went with this, or a variation of this at least. How can you make 2 months' salary last forever? Now, previously around engagement rings, there was no benchmark about how much you could spend. It was the Wild West. Some people would spend very little, some people would spend very much. There was no social norm. It didn't matter. You just spent what you wanted to. But De Beers came in with a unique message. They said 2 months' salary, that is around the amount you should spend on an engagement ring. And why did they say 2 months? Well, because if you spend 2 months worth of salary, you'd be able to afford a diamond wedding ring. Now, this was an anchor, and it dramatically changed consumers. Consumers perhaps weren't likely to spend 2 months' salary. Perhaps they were only likely to spend a month or 4 weeks, 3 weeks, but it was still dramatically more than they were before. And this anchor was so effective that it encouraged millions of people to actually start spending more and buying diamond wedding rings. In the US, from the 1940s to the 1990s, engagement rings with a diamond in it went up from 10% to 80%. Same happened in Japan, and the same is happening in China now. What's amazing about that campaign is that they're still using it today. It's so successful at driving behavior that they haven't changed it in almost 80 years. Anchoring can have a huge effect on your audience, even if you're just using it in your marketing campaign. I'll finish with one of my favorite examples of anchoring, and it comes from Steve Jobs in his 2010 introduction of the iPad to the market. Now, the iPad was a really interesting launch from Apple, because previously with launches, people would be able to have a good guess about how much something could cost. They're launching a laptop, we know how much laptops could cost. If they're launching an iPhone, we know how much they could cost. But an iPad was brand new. Nobody had ever seen anything like the iPad before. Tablets were really, really brand new. And so before the launch, a lot of journalists were discussing online about how much this new product should cost. A lot of them said this should cost no more than $200, $300. After all, there is really no need for this in the market. Nobody needs a tablet. This was back then. Nobody needs a tablet. We've all got phones. We've all got laptops. But some guessed that it might be a bit more expensive. A couple of journalists said, you know what, I think this could cost around $1,000. After all, it's a lot of technology that you need to get in to that touchscreen. Steve Jobs took that. He took that and thought, brilliant, that can be my anchor. So after talking through all the benefits of the iPad, he presses a button and this number appears on screen, $999. And he says to the audience, you know, this is the cost that some of you have been predicting the iPad will cost. And I'm not surprised, because it's such a great tool and there's so much features and benefits from it. But what's funny is the majority of people in the audience had actually predicted it would cost $300. There's only a couple that thought it might cost $1,000. And yet he set this as an anchor. He then pressed the button on his clicker, and the 999 smashed into 1,000 pieces, and the real price of 499 was revealed. He said, we've worked so hard to get this price down to a level which is reasonable. We've worked so hard to get this price down to a level which we think people can afford. And the audience went mad. They actually started whooping and cheering and celebrating this price. And what's hilarious about that is that audience is the exact same people who just a few weeks before have been saying it shouldn't cost any more than $200 or $300. They were now saying, oh, $499, that's a great price. And it's simply because Steve set that anchor. So consumers alter their decisions with anchoring. Marketing campaigns and sales efficiency, as shown from De Beers and real estate agents, improves with anchoring. Prices, as shown by Steve Jobs, appear better value when they're anchored. And it's really important, I think, for marketers to think about ways they can anchor their messages in order to improve them. So that's the power of anchoring, another really important law piece of science that we need to remember. We've got one more, and this one won't take long, because I think probably going a bit over on time, but it's scarcity. Scarcity, all of us know scarcity. It is the idea that if a resource becomes scarce, we're more likely to want it. Concorde is a great idea. The day that Concorde said they were going to stop flying, that flights were going to halt, I think it was a year's time, the sales of Concorde tickets went through the roof. Nothing had changed about Concorde. The seats were the same, the price was the same, the service was the same, And yet when people figured out it was a scarce resource, people were more likely to buy it. Well, one of my favorite studies on scarcity comes from 2000 by a researcher called Ian. Now, what she did was she set up these booths within supermarkets in the US that were selling jam. And she wanted to test the booths. So on alternative weekends, she would make one change to the booth. The look of it stayed the same, the salespeople stayed the same, but the one change she made was the varieties of jam she would show. So one weekend she would have 24 varieties, and the other weekend she would have 6 varieties. Now, conventional marketing wisdom would suggest that the 24 variety version of the booth would be more successful. After all, if there's more variety, consumers can pick and choose, they can find a jam that they want, and they can buy it. With more choice, you should get more action, right? That is the conventional marketing wisdom. But Ian found something very different. When comparing the sales of both booths, she found that 30% of consumers made a decision and actually bought when there were only 6 varieties, and only 3% bought when there was 24 varieties. So something really interesting happening here. Now, there's something about choice paralysis, which is definitely part of this, which is slightly different, which is when we have too much decision to make, too many choices to make, we're far more likely to take action. There's also a scarcity effect here. Having less choice, seeing something is a scarce resource, makes us more likely to buy. And one of the ways that this isn't applied, but it should so easily be applied, is with movie posters. If you look at a movie poster, and yes, there aren't many movie posters out at the moment, but remember back to a time when there were heaps of movie posters. You'll never see anything on the movie poster which says when the movie will stop airing. It says when it will premiere, it says when it will come out, but you'll never see when it will stop airing. And what's really interesting is if you tell consumers, if you tell moviegoers that a movie is about to stop airing, or it might be ending this week, it is far more likely that they'll actually go and see it. So saying on a movie poster, this movie is ending this weekend, this is your last chance to go and see it, adding a bit of scarcity makes consumers 36% more likely to attend. It's a great nudge. It's a great bit of science that you could apply to your marketing to grow sales. What's fascinating about scarcity as well is it affects us in all walks of life. So we as individuals, as humans, notice scarcity in our own life when we get to a certain age. So when we get to a 9-ending age, this is according to research done by Dan Pink, and it can be 29, 39, 49, 59, our behavior changes. Why does it change? Well, because we realize that our life is a scarce resource. So now this is really interesting. When you get to a 9-ending age, you are, according to marathon data, far more likely to run your first marathon. There is a huge spike in the number of people who have an age ending 29, 39, 49 to run a marathon, to sign up and run for a marathon. Simply because when people get to that age, they think, oh my God, my life's a scarce resource. I'm about to go into another decade. I need to do something important. So let's sign up and run a marathon. If you're selling running shoes, by the way, try and advertise to people with a 9-ending age. You're probably going to be far more successful. According to website data from Madison Ashley, I can't remember the name, it's probably a good thing, but the marital affairs sort of cheating website, you are far more likely to sign up and consider cheating on your partner if you have a 9-ending age as well. Scarcity does weird things to us. And according to census data too, unfortunately, you're also far more likely to commit suicide if you have a 9-ending age too. Scarcity affects us in all walks of life. It's a really important principle that we should be aware of. And then I'll finish with one of my favorite applications from scarcity. And it's just a classic marketing application, and it just shows how powerful scarcity can be if we apply it to our message. So if you have a message in a supermarket which says buy soup, if you put up big advertisements in the supermarket saying buy soup, funnily enough, people will go and buy soup. Consumers will go out there, they'll buy soup, and on average, those who buy will buy 3 cans of soup. This is what researchers, I think in Utah, who were doing this study, discovered. So marketers could then just pat ourselves on the back and say, brilliant, marketing works, put big signs up saying buy soup, and people will buy soup. However, the researchers wanted to try something different. They wanted to try if adding a little bit of scarcity would change the amount people bought. So they put a little asterisk on that sign that said buy soup, and they said, oh, by the way, sales are limited to 12 cans per person. Now, this is really silly because nobody was buying 12 cans before. No one was even close to buying 12 cans. The average bought was 3 cans. And yet, placing this slight limit on the amount people could buy built in their minds this idea that this was a scarce resource, and it dramatically changed decision making. Now, Those who bought, instead of buying 3 cans, bought 4.5 cans on average, a 50% increase just with a little bit of scarcity. How have I applied this to my role? Well, when I first started as a marketer, we did these end of year newsletters, and we had this brilliant year where we had released dozens of different features, dozens of different solutions. And I got really excited. So I wrote this really long newsletter talking about all of the great things we did, all of the dozens of different features of applications we had created. The newsletter bombed. Nobody read it, nobody engaged with it, nobody clicked through, nobody bought our products off the back of it. The next year round, I learned about scarcity, I learned about choice paralysis. I reduced the number of things on the newsletter right down from dozens to just 3 and had a much better effect. Understanding the power of scarcity can really help you in your marketing because scarce resources drive action. Behavior shifts when scarcity is known. It is one of the simplest ways to improve the effectiveness of your marketing. And if you emphasize scarcity, you can really influence the behavior of your consumers. That is the power of scarcity. We talked about distinctiveness, we talked about anchoring, we talked about scarcity. Those are just tiny principles, or just a few principles, I should say, in the world of behavior science and consumer psychology. If any of this has interested you, if you're really keen on finding out more around the science behind how we make decisions, then do please come and check out my podcast on nudge. In the show, I spend 20 minutes interviewing some of the world's experts on behavior science, some marketing pioneers, and some researchers who are actually conducting this research themselves, and understand how consumers make decisions and talk about how you can apply all of that to your marketing. So if you're interested in discovering more, Nudge is the place to go. You can find it anywhere you listen to podcasts. So go and search for Nudge to check that out. All right, that's all I've got time for today.